everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today is part 2 of my reacting to your controversial opinions. So I did part 1, and a lot of people were asking for part 2, so here it is. You guys have a lot of controversial opinions, so there's a lot more to talk about. If you want to see my first video, I will link to it above and in the description box below. In the first video, I talked about veganism, whaling, hunting, and today we're going to be talking about some new topics. So one of the controversial topics that I've somewhat touched on before is zoos. So someone says, zoos and aquariums are an important aspect of conservation. They inspire and educate the masses and provide in situ research for scientists. Absolutely depends on the well-being of the animals in captivity, of course, and not all zoos are bad. Okay, so this one comes up a lot, especially once Tiger King came out, and the whole idea of keeping especially like tigers and lions in zoos was renewed with all sorts of new enthusiasm. And here's what I think. I should also preface this by saying this is just my viewpoint. I do not represent all biologists and all scientists in any way, because this is totally split within the biologist community. But I personally am very pro-sanctuary, not pro-zoo. And I know I'm going to upset some people with this, but let me explain. So the difference that I've generally been taught between zoos and sanctuaries are that generally sanctuaries, all of their animals are rescued animals that cannot be re-released, or they're animals who will eventually be re-released and they're currently being rehabilitated. Zoos, on the other hand, are animals that will mostly come from captive breeding projects, some taken from the wild, and sometimes there's a small percentage of them that are rescued animals. So a zoo doesn't necessarily exist for the benefit of the animal. It exists for its display in the zoo and to provide a real life figurine or way for people to observe wildlife without it being in its natural habitat. It's been taken out of its natural habitat and it's put in a cage or an enclosure trying to mimic its natural habitat in some cases. In other cases, they are just roadside zoos, can just be complete trash. So there's a huge difference between Joe Exotic's zoo or a roadside zoo and then like the San Diego Zoo, which arguably does a lot for conservation as far as their rescue, rehabilitation, and captive breeding programs. So I recognize there's a huge spectrum in between. So it's hard to say that all zoos are good, all zoos are bad. I think it ultimately comes down to like, I want that organization to prioritize above all else the health of the animal. And many zoos say that they do that, but often there comes this place where, well, we also need to provide for the visitor experience. We need to make it educational, and, you know, there's not always room for these large enclosures because we can't have a large enclosure because people need to be able to see the animals. So then it starts getting to the realm of, well, now it's about money and it's about trying to get as many people in the zoo as possible versus what is best for the animal. And I don't think that it's fair to keep an animal in captivity and take it out of the wild solely for education purposes and to be displayed in a zoo. I think that animals have the right to exist in their own landscapes, and an animal's behavior in a zoo is not at all reflective most of the time of the animal's behavior in the wild. A lot of times you're going to zoos and you're seeing tigers that are pacing back and forth, which is a symptom of captivity, basically, and psychological issues associated with captivity, these obsessive behaviors. And you see that a lot with the big animals that are in these smaller enclosures. Wolves can travel in the wild. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's somewhere around 20 kilometers a day. And if you take a wolf that's meant to travel 20 kilometers a day and you put it in something the size of basically like what is the equivalent of like a small cage for that animal, it's not going to be a 20-kilometer wide cage in a zoo, that's for sure. You start to see the psychological effects of keeping that animal in captivity. And I don't think you can justify the harm being done to that animal just for the sake of, well, kids can go see that animal in captivity. I just don't think that that's the thing that's best for the animals. It's better to see animals in their natural habitat, even if that's like outside your bedroom window, watching robins in the tree, going to your local park. I mean, you don't have to hold animals in captivity for people to care about them. At least you shouldn't. That said, though, I totally recognize that a lot of zoo programs will captive breed animals that are not that harmed being in enclosures, and sometimes they'll actually re-release them. Totally supportive of those ethical programs and the ethical side of it, but I would just like to see zoos turn into sanctuaries. That's what it comes down to, is because it can be okay to have animals in captivity if they're animals that are being rescued. And God knows we have enough animals out there in the world that need to be rescued and rehabilitated when possible, so that we can fill all the zoos in the world full of that. The problem is that the animals aren't like the glamorous ones that people come to zoos to see all the time. Like a white tiger doesn't even really exist in the wild. It's something that's made up by breeders, but people want to see that like white tiger. They might not necessarily be as happy seeing a bunch of rescued meerkats, for example, because they want to see this charismatic megafauna and they want to get as close as possible to it and try to take pictures with it. And I think that comes down to something we need to examine in our own heads. Like, why do we need to interact with these animals to care about them? Why can't we focus on conserving the natural habitat of these animals and enjoy the fact they're having an amazing life in the wild instead of being locked in a cage so that I could go take a picture next to it? I know I'm getting like, oh, we've been talking about this one for a while. I'm already at like 8 minutes in this video. Okay, I guess I don't like say this to say zoos should be shut down. I just want to see zoos do more conservation and more rescuing and rehabilitation, and less keeping animals captive for the sake of them being captive so people can see them. If you work at a zoo or anything like that, please, I'm not saying you're a bad person or anything like that. I just want what's best for the animals, and I want to see all zoos come up to the standards that like some of the top zoos are at with their rescue and rehabilitation. The next controversial opinion is about nuclear power. My boyfriend hates it when I say the way I say it, nuclear or nuclear. I say nuclear, which is like, I think that's the wrong one. So I'm sorry, that's just the way my brain works. Let's just roll with it. I think we need to invest massively in nuclear energy. Nuclear energy could have been the answer to climate change and would have been by far the lesser evil. Fear-mongering and counterproductive anti-nuclear, mostly environmental activists killed this prospect. It seems that my opinion that nuclear energy is safest and most efficient is unpopular. Okay, so I'm going to start off by saying this is not my specialty. Some of these were starting to go outside of my specialty. So I probably know as much about nuclear power as you guys know, to be honest. So don't take my opinion as an expert opinion. It's frustrating. So I'm really split on it. I see the good and I see the bad. I think a lot of pro-nuclear people tend to say, well, it's zero emissions, so therefore it's good. But then when you look at like the cleanup of these power plants, I used to live next to a nuclear power plant, Diablo Canyon power plant. And we had to do nuclear meltdown like drills every single year, because if something had happened to that power plant, we could all have just died. And there was really not much you can do in the drills. It's like a practice of trying to evacuate the city as fast as possible in the event of a potential meltdown and widespread death. That was really freaking scary when I was a kid. Growing up with that, there are downsides to it. There are potential disasters. You know, we've seen that in history. Then the fact that these, nuclear power sources do not just naturally decompose within our lifetimes. There's something that's permanent and serious energy. So that's definitely scary for me to really promote that. But then on the other hand, well, what are we using in the meantime? We're using dirty fossil fuels that are environmentally, objectively probably can be considered more harmful, at least to the climate. I don't think it's the answer to everything. I think we have other alternatives that I'm more interested in, wind and solar and hydro to some extent, but so I'm split on it. So I'm somewhere in between all of those opinions. Let's talk about lethal species management. There's two parts to this one. Feral/wild horses and burros should be managed as an invasive species legally. Dogs cause just as much environmental disturbance and degradation as cats. This is another one that's split across wildlife biologists. As someone who has a strong belief personally in deep ecology and the right for all animals to live a life independent of their value to humans, I do not support lethal species management, even in the case where it could be in the long term environmentally damaging in some ways, or at least you can argue that. It's the same way that I feel about to be honest. I don't think that we have the right to take a life. And also, if you look back in history, so much of our lethal species management, such as killing off our apex predators, ended up completely destroying things over time. And I know that's not a comparable argument to invasive species, because like scientifically we know that they do not help. A lot of them are not natural and were introduced into these ecosystems. So in some ways I see both sides there, but I think it comes down to a personal, the way I look at the world spiritually, not to get too woo-woo, but I don't think we have the right to take those lives. So I personally don't agree with that. And then on the point about dogs causing just as much environmental disturbance and degradation as cats, totally agree. It's in a different way most of the time. But where I live, no one puts their dogs on a leash. I go to these hiking trails around my house and I never see a dog on a leash. It's all dogs off leash. Like people leaving their dog plastic poo bags everywhere. There's just poo bags as far as you can see. The dogs are scaring a lot of the nesting birds. You know, it's, extremely harmful to have your dog off leash in a natural area where dogs are not allowed to be off leash. And cats, of course, cause a lot of those same disturbances, specifically with hunting birds and destroying baby bird nests. Okay, this one I've been a little bit looking forward to. Let's talk about the child-free movement. So some people say choosing to go child-free for climate change is not really helpful compared to other lifestyle changes. Additionally, it perpetuates the Malthusian mindset of eco-fascists and alienates parents or people hoping to be parents from the environmental discussion. And then there's kind of like the anti version of that. So if human race numbers was reduced to say 1 to 2 billion, we live sustainably, environment and conditions on life would improve. We wouldn't be parasites over-consuming Earth's resources and threatening other species. We can do this by incentivizing having no kids or one child at most. Scientists and conservationists say that if a species overpopulates or become an invasive species, they are culled. Human culling is in order. Sorry. Of course, people can choose not to have kids and to be child-free. So I guess I'm not anti people choosing, but I don't think we should have to all be child-free to be environmentalists. I agree with who said that it can get into the territory really quickly. I totally agree with that, because I think that when you start talking about population reduction for climate change, it can often be quite racist when some of these conversations get started. Not saying that everyone that is going child-free for the environment is racist. Of course, I'm not saying that, but there are a lot of people who do kind of turn it into, well, look at these countries, these people have too many babies, and this is why the earth is overpopulated, when they don't take into account the fact that people in developed countries often are per capita way more environmentally destructive and taking up more environmental resources than people that are living in developing countries. It can be a little bit dicey once you start getting in those conversations, and I just don't think you have to be child-free to become an environmentalist. I personally want to have kids one day. I don't want like 10 kids, I just want like 1 or 2, but I don't think it should have to come down to either have a kid or care about the environment. My boyfriend's an engineer and I'm a scientist, so I feel like we got some smart genes, so maybe we'll be like birthing the future Elon Musks of environmentalism. No, I shouldn't say that. The future David Suzuki's maybe will be my children in the future. You never know. Fuck charismatic megafauna. I love how that's not even like, there's nothing else, just fuck charismatic megafauna. Okay, I love charismatic megafauna. I love my wolves and my orcas, but I see why people might be bitter about charismatic megafauna getting all the conservation funding. Oh, here's a good one. The Save the Bees movement is an instrument of big agro and overlooks native species. I totally get where this person is coming from, because I often think the Save the Bees thing, of course I care about bees. I love bees. Almost all the pictures on my Instagram page are bees, but there are so many other native pollinators. Mason bees is one of them. Okay, I know that's a bee, but just hear me out, okay? Mason bees are local, and I think it's something like 100 times more efficient than honeybees, like European honeybees, because most of the honeybees in North America are actually not even native species. They're imported from Europe. So, people forget about that. Our native bees. Also, people forget that like wasps and hornets are pollinators too. Moths are pollinators. There's so many other pollinators, but we always talk about bees. Why is that? I don't know. Is it a conspiracy of the big agro? I don't know. I don't know, where did Save the Bees movement come from? But anyway. I don't want to get too into it, but I want to save the bees. But I also want to save our native pollinators as well. Okay, and a lot of you guys talked about GMOs and asked me to give my opinion on GMOs. So some people say the world would be better off without the use of GMOs and pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, and we should move towards organic, ecologically harmonious methods of growing food. And some other comments about GMOs too. So, okay, I will preface this by saying I don't know that much about GMOs, and I am actually very undecided on how I feel about it. Yeah, I just don't know enough about GMOs to talk about it. I don't purposely avoid them or anything like that, and I'm totally open to like my opinion being swayed on this. It's just one of those realms of environmentalism that I just never really informed myself on. So if you have any recommendations regarding, from both sides, pro or anti-GMO, leave them in the comment section down below and I will check them out. As far as pesticides, I generally do try to buy my produce organic. And the reason for that is from an environmental perspective. There are a lot of pesticides that harm a lot of our native wildlife, our native pollinators, and as well as the soil. The way we do modern agriculture is not in this like holistic way. It's these monoculture crops that deplete the soil and in many cases deplete the aquifers of the area. So I've been reading actually about California's Central Valley and the way that a lot of our produce in North America is grown and how environmentally harmful it is. One of the books I'm reading right now is called Cadillac Desert by Marc Reisner, and it is about the American West and water and agriculture. So those ones I highly recommend if you're interested in learning more about like water and agriculture and how a lot of our stuff is grown in the West. I really do try to support definitely like people who grow their crops holistically, but that's not always easy to find. A lot of times just for sheer efficiency, like there are still a lot of monoculture crops. Even when you buy local, it's usually monocultures, but a lot of the organic crops are a little bit less harmful to both the environment and the workers that are picking those berries and those fruits and being exposed to those toxins in the air, breathing it in. The people who live next to non-organic farms and the people who are picking our produce and the people who keep us fed. So that's another reason why I tend to support organic produce, but I don't have the money to buy everything organic, but I just try to do the best I can. All right, guys, thank you for watching this video. Let me know about what you think of some of those controversial topics in the comment section down below. Thank you guys for watching this video, and I will see you next time.